Hi there. Welcome to this edition of HiBob Max, where we give you tips and tricks to maximize the potential of your HiBob system and to enable your team to flourish. I'm Tasha, HiBob expert here from the HiBob practice here at Silver Cloud. And today we're going to be covering the importance of a sickness process or an absence process and how to really set this up using the e-sign function and task lists to really automate the process, empower your managers to manage said process, but to give you as HR professionals the control to monitor the process from start to finish. So first of all, why do we complete a return to work? The return to work process helps to ensure that employees are fit to resume their duties and return to work. It provides an opportunity for the manager to assess the employee's health and make any necessary adjustments to their workload or environment to support their recovery. But also, it creates a smoother integration back to the workplace, which can reduce anxiety and potentially reduce repeat incidents or short term absences from turning into long term ones. So, first of all, we need to ensure that the sickness policy is set up to support the process to how best we want this to be. So, the way that we would do this is within our time off policies and our time off settings, we will create a policy type, a sick leave. We have already created one within our Bob system. However, I'm just going to talk through the elements of this. So, the appearance of this will be the name of that policy. So this will be the name that the employee will see when they are requesting that element of leave. Alternatively, and what we'll see in a moment, is that when the manager requests this type of leave, this is also what they will choose. You also have the option to choose a little emoji for your policy. I've just chosen the one with a little thermometer in his mouth there because I thought it was kind of cute. And then you can choose a color for that. And that color will only really be to view what that policy looks like within the calendar and the time off calendar for that person. When creating your policy, you will choose what unit that person can accrue time off for or how they're requesting that. We've chosen days, but you can go down to as low as a half day for your absence unit. Your activity type, if that is a not working paid policy, a not working unpaid policy, or a working policy. Working policies are really useful for when creating policy types for kind of working from home policies in order to notify someone that somebody's working from home and not from the office for one day or working from another site, something like that. And then under here, we have our request override. So requesting override could essentially be if I am on holiday and I'm off skiing, and unfortunately I've taken a tumble and I've hurt my leg, I've broken my leg. If that happens, I will then potentially want to turn that holiday into sickness. If that is the case, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to contact my HR team to do that. However, if we're going to give our employees some empowerment or option to do that for themselves, then we can also allow them to request that override. So then when they come in to re-request that process of sickness, it will override the holiday element to that. And then within here, we also have our reason code. So when submitting a time off request, we will be able to add a reason. If you don't put anything in here, then it's not going to have your reason code in there. That's not a problem for something like holiday. I'm not going to make my manager super jealous and tell her that I'm going to the Maldives for a week, for example. However, for sickness processes, it's super important to track the reason that someone might be off poorly so you can kind of highlight those trends or find out the reasons why someone may be off and unwell. So in here, we have our reason code list. So I've just popped a couple in here already. So our headache, migraine, sickness, other, and then work-related injury. But in here as well, we can also put leg pain, or any other reasons that we might then want to track for our reasons. So when I hit save and then save again, just in that very bottom, that will have created and made sure that any changes to my sick leave process have been updated. So in order to create the policy that we will attach to that policy type as a sickness process. There's lots in here at the moment just from our demo account. But I've created one in here just in very nostalgic Art Attack fashion. Here's one I made earlier. I'll click into this one. And I just want to talk through with you just some of the really key details as part of the policy process that are going to make it really helpful and either automate that process or really support that process as a HR professional to collect the data that comes on the back of that absence, or to make sure then that the managers have control of that process to really support their employees through an absence. So the allowance, we would always recommend it to be an unlimited balance, just because if you provide them with an annual allowance of 5 days paid leave, for example, anything over that may fall into another policy. So if you provide your employees with an unlimited amount of allowance for that, although it's not quite unlimited and we're not going to allow them to take all of their time off during the year, this just then gives you can track that still through reporting processes, which we'll show you at the end. We would also recommend that your cycles are aligned with your holiday year for ease. However, if you're a business that uses rolling sickness to track your absence for your employees, then again, you can utilize the reporting functions for this. Reporting within Bob is brilliant for pulling your reports for absence, sickness processes, for example, as per the policies. So within the probation period, you can prevent new hires from requesting time within this policy. However, from a sickness process perspective, we wouldn't recommend doing that because people can still be poorly during that probation period, as we know. And then we move into requests. So this is where we can really make this policy work for us. So we're going to choose work days only because that's the only time we want them to be poorly. The shortest amount of time that an employee can request, as I said before, we can go down to as low as half a day. If we had made the policy type an hours policy, you could go down to as little as 10 minutes. So it really depends on how you want to track that for your employees. Underneath here, within more settings, you can allow employees to request partial time off for multiple days. However, from an absence perspective, probably not so recommended. However, what's really great within these more settings is to allow open-ended requests. So if I toggle this, when I go in to request a employee to be off poorly within this policy, I don't have to submit an end date. So I can leave that open-ended if I don't yet know when they're due to return to work, for example. A really new, really super great feature within the system. Now, with a sickness policy, usually we're going to want potentially after a certain amount of time, we may want a sick note or a process to be followed in regards to that sickness. So you can add in and choose whether you would like a note to be mandatory or optional. So from a sickness perspective, mandatory is probably going to be super helpful just to give a little bit more context to why your employee is off poorly for the day. Your reason, so those reason codes that we've just updated in the policy type, how do we want to then move forward? Do we want them to be giving a reason for their absence in this instance? And then an attachment, for example, a sick note, a COVID-19 proof, photo of your test result, for example. So you can make it optional. You can add that they don't need to add any sort of attachment whatsoever in none, or you can make it mandatory. You can add any additional instructions. So in here, it gives you, please provide a doctor's note if sick for 2 or more days. And then underneath here, you can request a minimum request length requiring an attachment. So actually, if your absence is more than 5 days, then you can also create the process for requiring that attachment. As we've allowed employees to submit requests without an end date, attachments won't be marked as mandatory for open-ended requests. However, when you add your end date, it will advise you that your request was mandatory for an attachment. The next step within here is your visibility. So publicly, you may not want to show that that employee is unwell, is off sick, or for some of those potentially more sensitive policies like compassionate leave, for example, you may not want to put actually and show to the rest of your employee base that that specific employee is off poorly for one of those reasons. So what you can do is you can mark it completely private. which will then keep that policy name hidden from the organization's homepage and calendar. Alternatively, you can give it a custom name. So rather than that being open information in terms of sick leave, you could put out of office or unavailable, something along those lines, so that it's showing that that person is unavailable during that time. However, it's for a specific reason and that we're not going to be telling people what that reason is. Another really great tool within the sickness process is our restrictions. So request for this policy should not be submitted or modified by employees directly. This would mitigate any employees just updating their time off to say, I'm off sick today. This means that they aren't going to be able just to pop that request in, and the manager then may not see that later on during the day. And toggling this option on will encourage your employees to actually follow your process, your internal processes in terms of calling to say that they're unwell or making sure that contact is made to recognise and report their absence. So by doing this, this will then only be for the managers or admins and anyone who has that time off permission to make those changes or request on behalf of, to make sure then that only those people given those necessary permissions can request on behalf. So employees won't be able to make this request for themselves. If that is the case, as a manager, you aren't going to need to reapprove that process because you as a manager are going to put that process through and that absence through. So you may then want to toggle off approval is required. So if we turn that off here, you will then still be able to notify somebody about new requests. So you may want to notify the employee's first approver, or you could let somebody know in HR, for example, that that person has been off poorly for the day. That there is our sickness policy created to make sure then that this is really set up for success for you within your business. Now that we've created the sickness policy, what we're going to do is make sure that we are ready for that employee to come back into work. So we're going to create the e-sign process for this return to work. So you can do this within your left-hand ladder in Docs and e-sign templates. In here, I've just started, just to get ahead of the game, your return to work. So I'm going to click in here. It's in draft status at the moment. But I just wanted to talk through with you some of the really great elements that you can add into the e-sign document in order to create a really great return to work process. Within the form we have, I've set this out as tables just to make it really neat and tidy. But I can add in anything here on the right-hand side. So I can add in signature, I can add in initials, signature date and date field, two very different ones because when I create the signature date will populate. However, the date field I can manually populate myself. Text field, which will allow for open text for the process. Checkbox to make sure that we have two options, for example, that we then need to check off. And the employee field, which will pull specific information either from the manager's profile or the employee's profile, anyone that has a relationship set up within the employee's profile. And any compensation field, so any salary boxes. We're not going to need this for our return to work process. So in here, I filled in a couple already just for ease, but we're going to bring in our employee field first of all to our full name for the employee. I'm just going to make sure it fits my box. And then you'll see that the boxes that we have already within the form are block colors. This one here is just an outside line. That's because when I click in, it's not a required field currently. However, when I tick that, it will fill in the box and it will now become a required field that has to be filled in as part of the process. Because we've utilized an employee field here, what you can choose now within here underneath the data of the employee, or you can pull in, as I said before, any relationships that have been set up within the process. So we want the data of the employee. And this is then just what we're going to pick from that employee's profile. So I'm going to pick that display name. Now, when I open that form as the manager, it will pull the employee display name to pre-populate that letter or that form. To do that again, we're going to do that one more time within the employee field. It's already now required field, which is super helpful. It's the data of the employee and then their job title we're going to pull in. Now the date field, I can just drag and drop from the other side and it will pop that in there for me. I'm going to make that required. However, here is where I'm actually, when we process this and we create the order of which this is going to go to the employee or to the manager in that order, I want this to be filled in by the manager to make sure then that the date of the interview is done on the day that that employee returns back to work at the earliest available time. So I'm not going to assign this to the employee, I'm going to assign this to the manager. And in the same way, within the employee field, this will be the data of the manager. And I'm going to pull in the display name of the manager. So it would now show me throughout the form the employee display name, employee job title, and then when thinking about the manager in this kind of brownie orange color, the manager and the display name. So that's the information it's going to pull across from the employee profile. So I'm going to pop in another date field in here. Again, these are all our manager fields because they are in this orangey brown color. I'm going to pull across our text field for the duration of absence and make that required. And this is where it gets really exciting. We have our checkboxes. So I'm going to pull across the checkbox here. The checkbox options that you have now populated on the right-hand side, I'm going to make this required because I do want to make sure that it is required. However, I can now add more than one checkbox because potentially I'm going to want my yes or no options here, but only one of them to be chosen, depending on which one is necessary for the form to be completed. So what I'm going to do on the right-hand side here, I've got one element in my group at the moment. If I click the little plus button, click add to group, just adds me one more box within here. So I can put that next to my no option. And how many are then required as part of that process or as part of that checkbox? Well, one of them. I only want one of them maximum to be selected. So it's already default in here. However, if I had more than one option, then you could add in more checkboxes and update your minimum and maximum selection to make sure that that process is followed correctly. And again, choosing your assignee who is going to be filling out that box. I'm going to add in another text field here for my summary of discussion. And then in here, we have our final pieces of the puzzle. We have our signature and our signature date. So where I click signature, I'm just going to fit that to the box. You can do so just with the little, as you would on your any normal kind of Word tool, for example. You've got your little corners here that you can stretch and manipulate that to the size you want it to be. And again, I still want this one to be the manager. And same again for the signature date. You'll notice that there isn't a required field in here because that will link to the signature for the signature date to then be pre-populated. And I'm going to do the same for signature down here for the employee. So now you'll notice that it's still the same color within that orangey brown color. So I'm just going to change that assignee to the employee. And that's really key because actually what we have here on your right-hand side now that I've clicked away from any of the text boxes that we have, any of the elements that you can bring in are still down here down the right-hand side. However, you then have your recipient's order. So because we've now created more than one element within the form, and we actually want that to pull either from two different spaces or we want two different people to be filling out that process or that form, then you can add whether this is The employee goes first, so the employee could sign that and make sure that this is all correct for them. Alternatively, and in this process, we are going to want that to be created from a manager perspective first and foremost, for the manager to fill out these elements. Once they've been filled out and the manager has signed and signature dated, the employee will then be able to sign that off as a true reflection of the conversation that's been had. The rest of this form, we have our message down here. This will just be your notification that's sent to the manager to be completed as part of the process. So the subject box will be, please complete your employee's return to work form. And again, your message. Within the system, you can pull in variables into any emails, things like that. This one isn't one of those that you can pull variables into. So this element will need to be pretty generic in terms of the message that you're sending so that it doesn't then reference any specific employees or any specific information that can be tracked back to that specific employee. So you recently had an employee absent as part of the policy. You are now required to complete a return to work. Please review with your employee and sign off their return. As you go down, you can minimize that to make it a little bit easier to see. And notifications. So once that has been completed, do we need to let anybody know? Do we need to tell somebody that that return to work has been completed? For me, I would definitely say the HRBP of that person would probably want to know, but you can choose any of these to be within any roles or specific employees. Recommendation from our team here at SilverCloud is to always choose a role over an employee. And the reason we say that is just because if that employee leaves the business, then potentially you might need to come in here and replace that employee, for example. Whereas if you choose a role, anyone who fits the conditions of that role within that employee's profile will receive that notification. And any reminders. So when someone's taking too long to sign the document, you can send them nudge reminders for that. So I'm going to click set reminders and I'm going to send it every 3 days at 12 o'clock, 10 o'clock, for example. And you can set your time zone for that too. So if I hit save here at the top, I now have the option to preview my form. So I'll just show you what that looks like as part of this process. I'm going to preview this as myself. So if I click preview, lovely. As the employee, for example, if I've been unwell, my information is all under here. And I can see then, as we pulled in the information from before, that this has pulled my name, my job title, my department, for example, from my employee profile. And I'll have the option at the bottom to be able to sign my form. My manager is Dwight Schrute. So if I come out of here and preview that as Dwight Schrute, I can still only see that as the employee for that process. However, what I will do is I will show you what that looks like as a manager from my process that I created earlier. So I'm going to come out of here now and exit, but hold that thought because we'll create a task list for that in a moment. I created my employee yesterday and marked them as off sick. So what I've now received is my notification within my HiBob home screen to review documents and take action. So this is going to be the e-sign that I set up prior to this session. So I can see now as a manager that Patty Lorena was off poorly yesterday. So the return to work document that I've created is here and available for me to sign. The date that it was assigned is here and who it was assigned by. So I've manually triggered that process for this. You'll see at the bottom the signature flow for this. So where we will have created that process from a manager and then the employee to create that, you then have the signature flow for that. You'll see that currently for me, it is pending and I've got a little grey clock here. And the next person that will go to will be Patty. So if I click review and act, and if I click continue, I've just for ease very quickly updated these with text fields. So answers in here. And then I will sign this as part of me. Now, I don't know if anybody has ever been able to write their exact signature by using a mouse. However, you do have the option to create that process and create your signature within here. That's not my signature for those of you. And then you can click type, which will then be able to manually type in your name to act as your signature within that. So if I click sign, I can update the date that I've signed that. Lovely. So when I didn't have this in here, and if I click out, I'm not able to save and send. Because we had marked these as required fields, they are now mandatory. So I will just pop in here, answer here, and then now I will have the option to save and send. So if I click save and send, lovely. That has now gone. If I log in now as Patty Lorena, she will now have this as an action to complete. So from that same view that we saw before, I have a little tick next to my name now, my photo, but Patty now has the clock. So if I click review and act for Patty, she'll see all of my answers that I've input here. And then now Patty will be able to answer and sign as necessary. When I created that form, I was able to choose once that process and that form has been completed, where that will go within Patty's documents folder. So if I was to go into my docs, I would have put it within a folder that she might not have been able to see from a permissions perspective. Lovely. So that's the process from an e-sign perspective. What we're going to do now is we're going to cover task lists and how to create that form within a task list and automate that process for you as HR professionals. You won't need to then worry about that process and it having to trigger manually when somebody is off unwell and trigger that form for the manager to complete on their return. In tasks and task list settings, you'll be able to create your task list as necessary. I'm going to go into my Tasha's testing folder in here. I'm going to add a task list. I'm going to call this HiBob Max Return to Work. I can add any description just to give a little bit more context as to why this task list may be triggered. I'm going to trigger this task list for 10 a.m. every day. I'm only going to include the e-sign within here. So essentially, I'm hoping that my employees are going to be calling up or letting me know as a manager as soon as possible that they have been unwell. If that's not the case, then any tasks that are generated after this 10 a.m., for example, will be generated that same day, just a little bit later on in the day, once Bob does a scrape of the system to generate any tasks that are required. Now, scheduling is where this makes it really important and really automated and really nifty for you guys as HR professionals. So within ad scheduling, I am going to select an anchor event. So an anchor event is essentially once this process happens or once this date comes around, this task list will be triggered. And you can do this based on any event, so the first day of the year, last day of the year, the employee's birthday. If you wanted to send them a card for their birthday, for example, this will then trigger those things for you on the back of that. But the one that we want is a time off policy type. So that's sick leave policy that we've created. So now when somebody is marked as sick, this will start triggering that process. Applies to is what employees can be off sick. Everyone can be off sick as an employee within your organization. So that can be all employees, or you can select by condition and just choose that to be any employees that are employed, or just by choosing any of the conditions within your filters. Save and next. Now this is where we will create our task itself. You click into Create Task and down to eSign Request, request name, and then I'm going to choose Return to Work document. And it will have the signature order for me, so manager and employee. And then where am I going to save that? I want to save this within their advisory docs, or I want to save this within an employee's confidential docs folder, for example. It's really key here to mention that if you do want this to be seen in their confidential documents folder, but the employee does maybe have access to those folders, for example, that the correct permissions within documents and within permission settings within the back end of the system will need to be created and correct for that viewability for the employee. Now, when should this task be triggered? So we've just chosen on sick leave, that is the anchor date for our process to be started and triggered. So we can now choose whether we want this to be processed one day after that sick leave date. So we could set this up for if my employee is off today, I know they're not going to be back today. So do I then want to send that form for tomorrow, just so that it's ready then for when that employee comes back to work? Or just for ease, do we want to send it on the day that they are sick? Just so then that manager does again have that ready for when that employee returns back to work. So by hitting save and then done, when I then go to mark my employee as unwell, which because we chose the process of employees were not able to request this policy for themselves. So if I log in as Patty again, I'm going to use my other employee. If I log in as my employee, and go to request time off, I wouldn't be able to request time off for this. So I have the option to see it within the policy list. However, as you can see, only individuals with the required permissions can submit this request. So I cannot hit submit as the employee tester. As employee testers manager, I can go in to their profile, into time off. So this will take me to that employee's individual time off record. If I go to request on behalf and then choose sick leave, this is where now I can toggle that it's an open-ended request. So if the end date of this person's absence is unknown, I can choose for today, but it then wouldn't require me to give an end date. So I can toggle that on and off, and it will choose between whether I add an end date in here as next week, for example, or I can then tick whether it's all day or just the afternoon for this part of today, for example, and it will then continue to clock up for the open-ended request. If I know that this person's going to be off poorly until the 9th of May, because we requested that as part of the process, after 5 days, we require a attachment, I now have this little alert here that says this request requires an attachment. I can add in my reason. I can add in my note. And this note here is really key for when you are providing, your employee is providing your reason for being unwell, that actually your manager then will be able to add in here exactly what's been said, so that then when that employee returns back to work, there isn't any kind of differences in reasoning for being unwell. And then by uploading file, I can then choose my file for an attachment. So now that alert has gone. When I hit submit, that process will now be in progress, and I will see that this sick leave is here and available for me. This process is super easy to set up, as you will have seen from my demonstration, and actually really important as part of a process within a HR system and a HR function to make sure then that really your employees are supported in coming back to work, but also in making sure that a real robust policy is created to make sure that there's no differentiating from that policy. Hope you've enjoyed the session. Thank you so much for watching.